Well, good evening. Welcome to the Thursday night study here at the Douglas Hills Church of Christ, where we're going to continue our study into evidences. Over the last 12 weeks or lessons, we've studied various pieces of evidence to show how faith in both God, His Word, the Bible, and in Jesus Christ is entirely reasonable. It's not something we accept blindly, but there is ample evidence to prove the existence of God, the fact that His Word is reliable, it's trustworthy, and that Jesus is who He claims to be by the power of the resurrection. And so tonight, though, we're going to switch our focus just for one class, which is our final class in this series, and look at the greatest hurdle in the minds of many for a belief in God or a belief in a benevolent God. And that is the problem of evil or pain or suffering. That, in the minds of many, is probably the greatest single struggle or hurdle for them to overcome, to come to believe in God and to believe in both His benevolence and compassion and love. One philosopher, he put it this way. He said, evil constitutes the biggest single argument against the existence of an almighty, loving God. And skeptics gravitate to this argument because it is a hurdle. Bertrand Russell, a British skeptic, in his book, Why I'm Not a Christian, said this. He said, I would invite any Christian to accompany me to the children's ward of a hospital, to watch the suffering that is there being endured, and then to persist in the assertion that those children are so morally abandoned as to deserve what they're suffering. He says, just because these innocents, these children are suffering, he can't tolerate the idea of a God or a loving God. David Hume, another skeptic, in his work called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, in restating an argument from Epicurus in the late 2nd or early 3rd century, says this, is he, being God, willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? And he said, because evil exists, because pain, because suffering exists, his conclusion that God is either not able or not willing or not existent. I want you to understand, though, this problem of evil and pain and suffering doesn't just roll off the tongue of the skeptic or the agnostic or the atheist. It's found on the lips of the people of God. Turn with me, if you will, to Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 6. We've just completed a study of Judges and Ruth on Wednesday nights. Mark led us in those studies. And in Judges chapter 6, we have the calling of the judge Gideon. And if you will, look at verse 13 specifically. But before we do so, notice what is said in verse 12. The angel of the Lord appeared then and said to him, the Lord is with you, O valiant warrior. The angel makes a claim that God had not abandoned them, despite the fact that they had been taken captive, despite the fact they were hiding in wine presses to thresh their grain, despite the fact that they were oppressed. He said, the Lord has not abandoned you. And here's Gideon's response in verse 13. O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? He's struggling with the problem of evil, of pain, of suffering. We also see it in the book of Habakkuk, in Habakkuk chapter 1 and verse 2. The prophet Habakkuk looking about at the evil of his day, wondering where God was in all this. He says in verse 2, how long, O Lord, will I call for help and you will not hear? I cry out to you, violence, yet you do not save. Where is God, is what Habakkuk is asking. He is struggling with the problem of evil, of pain, of suffering, of violence, of wrongdoing. It is not only on the lips of the skeptic, it's on the lips of the people of God as well. And really the question is, why is this the greatest hurdle? Why is this the greatest challenge to some individuals' faith? Well, I think first we have to recognize this idea of evil seems almost seemingly in contrast with the ideas of a loving, omnipotent God. who wants to do what is best for us and says he doesn't forsake us or doesn't abandon us. So how do those two things coincide? Secondly, it's a hurdle for some because this problem of evil and pain and suffering, it's universal. Every people of every, of every culture, of every time, have had to deal with issues regarding evil and pain and suffering, of loss, of struggle, of adversity. And not only that, it is entirely practical. So much of the study of evidences is theoretical or philosophical, at least in its beginning stages. But the problem of evil, of pain and suffering is intensely personal. It's experiential. People have experienced pain, some more than others, but all of us have suffered loss, have suffered adversity. So that's why it becomes such a personal problem for many, such a great hurdle. So the question before us really is there any viable reason that we could offer for why God would allow such evil or pain and suffering to exist? Is there an explanation or explanations that we could offer that we could take solace in and still believe in an all-powerful, all-loving God? And that's what we really want to try to offer tonight as we examine this idea of the problem of evil. But before we do so, I want to just take just a few minutes and examine two responses that I think are inadequate. And what I mean by inadequate is, one, the response doesn't fit the logical argument and facts as we know them, or it's not helpful. It's maybe even harmful to this question or examining the idea of the problem of evil. The first inadequate response I'm going to offer is atheism. Many people, when they consider evil or they consider pain or they consider suffering and they see it in their own lives or in the lives of others, one of the most common responses is, I no longer believe in God. God is non-existent. It's an atheistic response. But let me just suggest to you that without God, this is not a dilemma. The whole question of the problem of evil is a problem because we believe that God exists. If God didn't exist, the problem of evil is not something we would wrestle with. John Paul Sartre in Existentialism and Humanism says this: if God did not exist, everything would be permitted. David Freeman wrote this in a philosophical study of religion: the point is that unless moral standards have the approval and sanction of God, unless God is the moral lawgiver, there are no unchanging moral standards. What's he simply saying? To speak about the problem of evil, one must believe that there's an objective standard of evil that exists. And you cannot have an objective standard unless you have a lawgiver, one who declares right from wrong. This problem only exists because God exists. And so therefore, the response of atheism, I don't think is an adequate response to the information that we have, the evidence that is in our hands. But the second inadequate response may be one that we're guilty of, and that is simply oversimplifying the problem or reacting to the problem with a sense of arrogance or hubris. This is a real problem. And it's a real problem for some people on a very personal level because of the loss that they may have experienced, the pain that is in their lives, the adversity that they may have faced. And we need to be honest enough, not to be dismissive, but to realize this is a difficult question that has many answers and some answers that we can't even offer. Because the fact of the matter is, just as many issues surrounding God or many subjects surrounding God, we don't have all the answers. Mainly because we're finite and limited, and God is transcendent. And the only answers that we can offer are the answers that God himself has chosen to reveal to us. And so maybe that question we can't answer completely. And we need to be aware of that. I think really about the Old Testament book of Job. In chapters 38 through 42, we have this discourse, or mainly almost a monologue, between God where he instructs Job. And in chapter 38 and verse 4, you have the voice of God thundering. And he says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" And to kind of oversimplify a very profound book, the answer God gives to Job is that you're in no position to know why I put you through this, but you can trust me. God doesn't answer Job, not based because God couldn't answer Job, but because of the limitations that Job has because he's a creature. God says you will just have to trust me. And so we need to realize that as well when we begin to deal with this subject. And we also need to realize that you can have faith in God and still have questions about immediate circumstances that occur in your life. You experience loss or you experience adversity and you scratch your head and you say, why am I experiencing this? Or what is the point of this? How long will God wait before he answers my prayer? All of those are questions that are based on here and now, but can still be questions that we have and we can still express a faith in God. Much of the Psalms do that. Look with me, if you will, to Psalm 13. Just a short example of this. The psalmist writes there, David specifically, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart all the day? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death, and my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my adversaries will rejoice when I am shaken." Just notice what David is describing there. He is pouring his petition out to God, so he still believes in God. He just doesn't understand how his circumstances are working out for the furtherance of the will of God. He doesn't understand how long it's going to take before God responds, but yet he still prays to God and makes a statement of faith in verses 5 and 6. He says, "I have trusted in your loving kindness. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me." So we don't need to oversimplify the problem, but we don't need to think the problem is so insurmountable that we still cannot have faith in God, a God who loves us and a God who is all-powerful. So as we begin to kind of offer some solutions or some ideas to help counter this problem of evil, maybe we ought to start back a little earlier and just ask the question, what's evil? That seems like a very simple question, but this vexing question really has no simple answer. Even though each one of us can recognize evil when we see it or experience it. It's hard to create a comprehensive definition, but we know what it is when we see it. So from a philosophical standpoint, from looking at it from a great distance away, evil is typically divided in two main categories. There is moral evil. And moral evil is really evil committed between persons, one evil act committed against another. The second broad category is natural evil, and that is evil that is a result of the forces that control our world, that have been put in place in our world, and as a result of the fall. J. Edwin Orr gave this analogy to kind of understand these two types, these general categories of evil. He said, "A wayfarer takes shelter under a great rock, which, loosened by the rain, comes tumbling down and kills him. That's natural evil. A wayfarer takes shelter in a little hut, but a wicked robber stabs him to death. That's moral evil. Person to person, people to people, versus what we would call natural forces." And the reason I think this is something just important to note is because different arguments that people have proposed to solve the problem of evil have greater strengths in application to one type of evil over another. One argument you may submit may seem a stronger response to moral evils evils versus natural evils, or gratuitous evil, or other forms that we may call. And we just need to recognize that fact. So what I want to do for our class is just offer 3 responses. This is not meant to be comprehensive, and even these responses, in the limited time that we have, are not going to be complete. And there's going to be a lot of responses that we could offer and we could look at and examine further. We could look at things like sin and what sin is and how horrible sin is and how pain and suffering and evil show us the wickedness of our own actions. We could talk about how sin began in the garden and how the Bible provides an explanation of evil's beginnings. We could talk about a spiritual adversary who sows evil, if you will, in the form of Satan. We could talk about the ideas of mislabeling things as evil when they're really not, but maybe just the ideas of punishment or chastening. There's lots of arguments that we could examine that may be an adequate response to this, but I want to just examine 3. And the first of those responses is the idea of free will and the fact that us as created beings have free will. From the beginning, God made men with the ability to choose. In Genesis chapter 2, after creating man and placing them in the garden, he stated this in verse 16, "The Lord commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. From the day that you eat from it, you will surely die." God created man, placed him in the garden, and when he placed him in a garden, he gave him the ability to choose whether to obey God's command or succumb to the temptation of the serpent. Man has the ability to choose. And with the ability to choose comes the ability to disobey, or as some people have described it, the power of the contrary choice. The ability to do things that God would not approve of, that would be evil and wrong and bring pain and suffering on others. When God created, he created man with this ability to choose. G.K. Chesterton, in a work called Orthodoxy, he describes this process in a very figurative way, and it's kind of helpful to think about it this way. He said, according to Christianity, in making the world, he set it free. God had written not so much a poem, but rather a play that he planned as perfect, but which had necessarily been left to human actions and stage managers who have since made a great mess of it. The word necessarily there you may quibble with, but it's the idea that God made this world and created, and he had a perfect plan for it. He wanted to dwell with man. He wanted to have relationship with man. But he put the play in the hands of both the actors and the stage managers, and as a result of their own choices to disobey God, they made a hash of it. They made a mess of it. And in so doing, brought pain and suffering and evil into existence, bringing harm to others, and others suffered because of the consequences. But that raises a question for us, right? Why would God, a God who loves us, a God who is omnibenevolent, create man and give him this choice, knowing that a majority of people are going to make choices that disobey him and harm others and ultimately bring harm to themselves, maybe even causing them to be lost eternally? If he's really all loving, why would he do this? Create man this way? And I think that's a fair question. But as a fair question, we might ought to examine the alternative. The alternative to allowing us to be free moral agents, allow us to make choices, the only other option really is to make us robotic. To make us robots, to take away all choice from us. But that's not what God intended. There's an interesting passage found in Genesis chapter 1, in verses 26 and 27. And in chapter 1, verses 26 and 27 of the book of Genesis, it says this. It said, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our own image, according to our own likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." We have this fascinating statement that when Genesis records the creation of mankind, God created them in his image. Now, what exactly that means, we're maybe not for sure. I mean, it is probably so profound and multifaceted, we couldn't fully articulate everything that would include. But let me suggest to you something that it would include. An important component, that we have, because we're created in the image of God, have the capacity to choose love. But at the same time, we have the capacity to not show love. Let me think about that for a minute. There's a lot of things that God is described as in the Bible. He is to be compassionate. He is to be merciful. He's to be gracious. But there's only really, God is love. God is life. God is love. One of the attributes of who God is that he's a loving God and freely chose to show his love to mankind even when they're enemies toward him. He freely chose that. So for us to be created in his image means that we have the right to choose that. We have the capability to choose that. We have the capability to exercise free will. But with the free will comes the ability not to choose. And I'm going to suggest to you, when we see issues regarding pain and suffering and evil in the world, much of the moral evil that we see around us is a result of the free will choices of mankind, how we fail to live up to the image that God has created us for, that we exercise the power of the contrary choice, and in doing so bring harm on others and ultimately ourselves. I think that is a response that we need to seriously consider when we consider the problem of evil. A second response that I will offer is often called the greater good defense, or the greater good argument. And it's really the argument that evil or pain or suffering serves an instrumental and ultimately good purpose through the providence of God. That God, because of his omniscience, his omnipotence, and his omnibenevolence, can take that which is evil and create through it a good purpose, through his providence, through his actions. Augustine, depending on how you like to pronounce it, he says, "For the Almighty God, who even as the heathen acknowledge, has supreme power over all things, being himself supremely good, would never permit the existence of anything evil among his works, if he were not so omnipotent and good that he could bring good out of evil." You see what that says? Augustine is proposing the idea that evil does exist, but God is so omnipotent that he is able to use that evil for a greater purpose through his providence. One great example of that is Genesis chapter 50. In Genesis chapter 50, as we conclude the story of Joseph and his 12 brothers, his brothers who meant evil toward Joseph, who initially thought to kill him but ended up selling him into slavery, how others conspired against him or would forget him in prison or make up false accusations. In Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, we have this statement when he was talking with his brothers. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." God was able to take the evil intentions of his brothers, the actions, and transfer them or translate them or create a good purpose from them, the preserving of life. But not only that, I want you to think about that God can uses evil circumstances to actualize good. I mean, don't misunderstand me. Good is not dependent upon evil. Some have advocated that argument. God is good, in the absence of evil. He is perfection in all of his goodness. But us, as fallen creatures, people who have already sinned, it is through the adversity, the pain, the suffering, the struggle, the trial, that our character is perfected into the image of God. Think about, how do you gain patience except through adversity? How do you show courage except in the face of daunting pressure? How do you show love to enemies without there being enemies? The Bible points to those ideas. Look with me, if you will, in James chapter 1. James chapter 1. Verses 2 through 4. James here simply says this: "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials." Trials, the idea of pain or suffering and adversity, things that many people would call evil. He says, "Consider it all joy when you encounter these, brethren, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Or think about, if you will, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. "In this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials or temptations, so that the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." What is both James and Peter saying? It's through this adversity, these trials, that we could be perfect and complete if we meet them with perseverance and thanksgiving and joy. It's in the midst of these trials that our faith is perfected, that our faith is refined. God can even use those evil actions to actualize good. But I want to suggest another use of evil, if you will, or pain, or suffering, if we want to call those things necessarily evil. And it's an argument that's proposed by C.S. Lewis. And he simply says this is a fairly well-known quote, but he said, "God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." Now, the entirety of that quote, without sitting down and talking with C.S. Lewis, I'm not sure that I could advocate. But the general idea behind the quote, I think, is a profound one. The idea that God would use the adversity, the trials, the difficulties, the pain, the suffering, those things which are considered evil, to try to rouse a spiritless, deaf world, to awaken them to there's something more than this world, and they should desire something more from this world. Think about them, if you will, as spiritual alarm clock is basically what C.S. Lewis is describing there. An alarm clock to wake us up out of our spiritual lethargy, to remind us, if this is it, there's got to be something better, and to hopefully cause us to turn to God. So I would suggest to you this as a response to the problem of evil, the greater good argument. The final response is the ideas of the cross and judgment. Often when you talk to people about the problem of evil, or you think about pain and suffering, or adversity, or anything of the like, it's almost always presented as if God in the Bible just largely ignores it or tolerates it and has nothing to do with it. It's like God was riding a bike downhill, took his hands off the handlebars, and wherever it crashes, and I want to just tell you, there's nothing further from the truth. God is acutely concerned with evil and problems concerning pain and suffering. And the Bible deals with them honestly and openly. And there's no greater evidence to that than the fact that the Bible speaks of both the judgment in time and at the end of time and the cross itself. I want to just first of all say that God is just doesn't simply tolerate evil. God does bring judgment in the midst of time. Now, it may not work on our timetable. It may not happen like we think it would happen. It may not happen when we think it should happen. But God does judge evil even in time. We think about when Joshua went in to conquer the land of Canaan, and God instructed them to destroy the inhabitants of that land, all the peoples of that land. And he said in chapter 9 of the book of Deuteronomy in verse 5, "It is not for your righteousness or for the uprightness of your heart that you're going to possess their land, but it's because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord your God is driving them out before you, in order to confirm the oath which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So why are they going to get to go in to possess the land? Is it because they're righteous, that they're just so much better than everyone else, that they're so upright, paragons of virtue, that God is going to give them this land? He said, no. He said, the reason you're going in to possess this land is because it is my judgment against their wickedness. And we see nations that have been raised up and they begin to act wickedly, and God cast them down, whether it was the Babylonians or whether it was the Assyrians. Whether it was people like King Saul, even in Israel, who disobeyed the Lord and didn't offer the sacrifice of the Amalekites as he should, and God stripped the kingdom from him. God does judge in time. He is not tolerant of evil. He doesn't just ignore it or excuse it. Even in time, he does bring judgment. But maybe the greatest evidence of God's intolerance of evil and how he wants to solve the problem of evil and pain and suffering is the cross. It is God's greatest act of judgment against evil and his greatest expression of love. And not only that, he sent his son, who endured pain and suffering like we did, to die for us to provide the remedy. E.J. Carnell wrote this: "The cross of Christ is God's final answer to the problem of evil, because the problem of evil is in the cross itself." W.H.T. Gardner wrote this: "Against the dark background of man's failure and sin, the cross shows us the measure of God's passion against evil and the measure of God's passion to redeem his sinful people." So not only is it God's judgment against evil, it is through the cross when God reconciles men to himself and he begins to show them a new and a living way, that he transforms their character, that much of the evil in this world should be eradicated. If I act like Christ, I'm not going to harm my brother or my neighbor. Look with me, if you will, to Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1, beginning in verse 19, where Paul wrote, he said, "For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him," that is Christ, "and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of the cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. And although you were alienated and hostile in mind, engaged in evil deeds, yet he has now reconciled you in his fleshly body through death, in order to present you before him holy and blameless and beyond reproach, if indeed you continue in the faith, firmly established and steadfast, and not moved away from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a minister." Do you see what Paul's saying? That God has chosen to reconcile all things to himself through the cross, whether things on heaven and on earth. And those things that he reconciled, those things were alienated and hostile, and they were engaged in evil deeds. And he says, through Christ you will be reconciled, in verse 22. And you will be presented before him holy and blameless and beyond reproach, if you indeed continue in the faith. It is through the cross that God deals judgment against evil and shows his intolerance of it and his design to make that which is evil good and in the likeness of Christ. And if that's not enough, the Bible speaks of a final judgment, where there's a final reckoning that God shows his intolerance for those things that are evil and unjust and wrong. In Acts chapter 17, When Paul was speaking to the philosophers there on Mars Hill, or the Areopagus, however you would like to say it, in Acts chapter 17, verses 30 and 31, he told them this. He says, "Therefore God, having overlooked the times of ignorance, is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man who's appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead." Paul talks about the fact that God has appointed a day, that he will judge not the world in righteousness. That is, he will judge it with the right standard from the holy purview of heaven itself, where everyone will come before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account for the deeds that are done in the body, and evil will get its comeuppance. God is not intolerant about evil. And even though it may seem like a little while that we have to deal with it, and at times it seems like it's overwhelming, God is aware of that. And he is still omnipotent and omnibenevolent. David Trueblood Elton wrote this. He's talking about the Christian, the believer in God, has abundant reason to believe in God in the full theistic sense. If then he runs into some difficulty, even a difficulty as great as the problem even, he does not for that reason give up his faith. The reasons for his faith are so great, they can weather a few storms. In Psalm 34, the psalmist invites, he says, "Come and taste the Lord to see that he is good." The reason we study the problem of evil at the end of a class of evidences is we need to understand the evidence for the existence of God, and the reason that we can trust the Bible, and we can look how Jesus Christ to be the life, the way, the one who offers hope and forgiveness through the power of the resurrection. Because once we come to grips with those things and are assured of those things, then we can address the problem of evil, even with all its challenges to us. And even though we can't answer every question that's posed to us, we can still believe in a God, and a God that the Bible describes as benevolent and compassionate and merciful and loving and gracious, and whose benefit we've experienced in our life, his graciousness that we've experienced in our lives. So I think there is answers to the question for the problem of evil. They're not questions, they're not answers in the likeness of this is going to be the total answer. But there are answers. Answers that can help us get a glimpse into what God has revealed and how he chooses to deal with evil. And I've suggested 3. Man's free will, which is responsible for so much evil that exists in the world. Secondly, that God is able, because of his omnipotence, to take those evil things that exist in the world and turn them for a greater good through his providence. And finally, God is not intolerant of evil, but judges it in time, in the flow of history, and at the cross, and he has declared a final judgment. That's the lesson. That's the class tonight on the problem of evil, or the issues regarding pain and suffering. As such a vast topic, one class probably doesn't do it justice. And there's lots of other things that we could discuss regarding this issue. But hopefully this will just in some ways whet your appetite or cause you to want to further the study, or maybe just reassure you about there are answers to the questions that are get asked regarding pain and suffering and evil. If we could help you in that regard in any way, please reach out to us. Not that we claim to have all the answers, but we have a book that has answers in it, and we'd love to sit down and study it with you. And we will look at what God has chosen to reveal to us and what we can understand of this transcendent one who has sent his Son because he loves us and he wants to save us from this world. Thank you for joining us tonight. Lord willing, next Thursday night we'll start a new series of studies, and we're going to begin a study on God himself. One of the most foundational things that we could study. looking at God and his character. And we're going to begin by looking how God describes himself, the names of God, the names that he provides us, and shows us who he is and what he stands for. So hopefully, if you have time to join us next Thursday night at 7:30, we'd love to have you. Hope you have a great end of the week. Enjoy this beautiful fall weather. And if you're not have any place to worship on Sunday, please consider coming and visiting with us here at Douglas Hills. We have 2 service times at 9 and 11. And if you're able to get out, and you are getting out, we'd love to see you here. If not, because of the current crisis, we understand, and if you would go to our YouTube page or our Facebook page, we do live stream the service, and we'd love for you to join us in that way. I pray that God's richest blessings on you, and you have a great end of the week. Thank you.